We've talked about the Goto Anything panel and how it allows you to navigate easily through your files, and we've talked about the file catalog, which controls what appears in the sidebar and what you can navigate to via the Goto Anything panel. Now, Sublime also has another method of navigation, one that allows you to jump to locations and other files based on the context of what you're working on in the current file. And this particular feature is powered by something we refer to as the symbol index. And uncoincidentally, that is the topic of this week's video. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Oda Nerd here, and welcome to this video on the symbol index in Sublime Text. You may be asking yourself, what the heck is a symbol index, Oda Nerd, and why do I care? Well, this is actually a continuation of last week's video where we talked about the file catalog. Well, actually, it's not last week's video because last week's video was the first video in the new video series on the channel where we are going to be learning how to create packages and plugins in Sublime Text. Subscribe below if you're interested in that sort of thing and you haven't already. But prior to that video, we talked about the file catalog, which allows us to control what does and does not appear inside of the sidebar of the window when you have folders open and when you have files open, and which of those files should be available in the Goto Anything panel, which we also covered in a video previous to that. And if you're unfamiliar with either of those videos or that new course video thing on creating plugins, they're all linked down below this video for your immediate perusal once this video is done. But we saw as a part of all of those, by controlling the file catalog and using the Goto Anything panel, we could do something like open the Goto Anything panel and type core@log and immediately jump to a specific place, which is the log symbol. And we can push enter to open this or escape to go away if we wanted to just preview it. We can use the right arrow to pin this file and continue opening other files if we're interested in that sort of thing. A lot of functionality here, again, that is covered in those previous videos. The ability to do this is controlled by the syntax definition of the file that you're using. And remember, Sublime isn't a tool that's focused on only Python development or only web development or only C and C++ development. It's really open-ended enough to support any and all languages. And for that reason, it relies on syntax definitions to tell it how to syntax highlight files, what different parts of different files mean, so that it can convey that to you in a meaningful way. And as a part of that syntax highlighting, the author of the syntax also creates, or can create if it's relevant to the type of file, metadata information that tells Sublime which parts of this file are interesting for things like navigating in this particular fashion. So by having this file open, we're automatically having that functionality. And of course, we could choose any file and do that. And that works because as long as the file is open, here it's open in a transient preview. Note there's no tab associated with this yet because I haven't committed to opening the file. Because Sublime had to process this file anyway, it has that information at its disposal and we can navigate it. The symbol index is basically this to the nth degree. Instead of providing this only for the file that we're currently looking at right now, Sublime has the power to scan over all of the files in your project using specifications that you give it to gather all of these and store them into one symbol index or symbol database. And using that functionality, you can get more insight into the files that you're editing by knowing exactly where certain symbols are defined and where references to those symbols actually are. And we'll see examples of that as the video goes forward. So this is a very powerful technique for, again, navigating around in your files. And remember, the proviso here is that this is controlled by the syntax definition. So what you see in this panel and what will appear in the symbol index, and thus how the things we're going to be talking about in the video work, is dependent on the syntax definition. So if you're using a plain text file, that's not going to work. Here we're using a Python file. This will also work for things like HTML and C, but what is relevant as a symbol really does change from file type to file type. And all else being equal, if you're seeing syntax highlighting, that is, everything is just not all white or some other solid color, then there is a syntax definition in use. And if you're not seeing any symbols here, then you need to talk to the author of the syntax definition to ask them to create the appropriate metadata, if such metadata is possible, because not all file types really lend themselves to be navigated in this way. That's just part of that whole Sublime is very open-ended and can handle pretty much any language out there. The determination for what constitutes a symbol comes from the syntax definition. So anytime you have a file open, Sublime can inherently show you the symbols in it because it had to process the file in order to syntax highlight it. That's why the Goto Anything panel can do that. As soon as you have opened the panel on a file, you can immediately navigate to symbols because it has processed that file to be able to display it to you. The symbol index, on the other hand, needs the same information, so it gathers that in the background so that you don't have to open the files first. This does mean that depending on the size of projects that you're using, when you first open a folder or project, it can take a little bit of time before the symbol index and all of the functionality that depends on it are available to you. And for that reason, if you were to go to the command palette, there's a command in here labeled indexing status. This also exists under the help menu as well, which opens a dialog box that tells you the status of the indexer at any given time. The top tells you if it's actively indexing or not. Right now it's idle. There's also a progress bar to tell you how long it's taking, and text in the bottom that indicates what the indexer is actually doing. So if you're ever in doubt about whether the indexer is running or not, or how long it's taking, you can look here and Sublime will tell you if it is actively indexing, how many files it's processing, and how long it's taken to be able to do that. When it comes to controlling the indexer, we have a few settings at our disposal. The first of those is the index files setting. This setting is a Boolean that controls whether the indexer runs at all. It defaults to being turned on. You can turn it off if you don't want to ever use the index. You can also turn it off if you just want the index disabled for right now. For example, if you're working on a very large project and you don't want it indexed, or if your project is stored on a network file share and it's just taking too much time, or perhaps if you're working on a laptop and you don't want to consume extra battery power indexing files in the background, you can turn it off in order to preserve your battery life. The next setting is the index workers setting. Now, the indexer does work in the background scanning files. This setting tells Sublime how many background processes it should use to be able to do that. The default setting for this is 0, which gets Sublime to try to determine on its own how many background processes it could use. Now, to some degree, the more processes it uses, the faster the indexing will go, at the potential expense of how responsive your computer is while you're using it. If you have a very fast computer, that may not be as much of an issue as if you have a slow one. When in doubt, if the indexer seems to be taking too much time, instead of turning indexing off entirely, you can tweak this setting so that instead of Sublime determining on its own, you could set it, for example, to 1 to have the indexing happen, albeit at a little bit of a slower pace. Now, when it comes to the files that are actually being indexed, that is controlled by two other settings. The first of those we're going to discuss here is the index excludes pattern. And much in the same way as the file catalog normally assumes it should use all of the files in the folder that you've given it except for the files in this pattern, this works the same way. The indexer will index everything that is appearing in the catalog, which means if a file doesn't appear in the sidebar, Sublime's not going to index it. But you can also exclude other files from that based on their type, perhaps if they're too large or you know you're never going to want to go into them, by adding them to the index exclude pattern setting. And much like we saw again in the video on the file catalog, you can switch Sublime out of thinking that it should be everything but these files to an only these except mode by using the index include patterns instead. And if you do that, you're switching from include or index everything except these files to only index specifically the files that I give you here. And you can still exclude from that list as well. Those two settings, the index include patterns and the index exclude patterns, can appear not only in your global preferences, but also in the folders of projects if you happen to be using them. In the same way as you can modify the catalog on a folder by folder basis in a project, you do the same thing with the index. Remember, these settings won't go in the settings part of your project, they'll go in the folder specific settings. It's also worth noting that by default, Sublime only has an index exclude pattern setting set. It doesn't have an index include patterns because that would stop it from indexing anything except those particular file patterns. So you probably only want to fiddle with that setting if you have very specific needs. We've talked about what the symbol index is and how to configure it, but we haven't actually seen any concrete examples of why it's useful in the first place. So for this example, we're going to use my override audit package for Sublime Text, which helps you work with and manage your packages and package overrides in Sublime. There's also a video on the channel covering this package in more detail if you're interested in what it can do for you. But we have seen in previous videos that if I was to use the Goto Anything panel, I could, for example, type core at log like this. And it's showing me a preview of the core.py file and specifically jumping to the symbol log. Now, this will work whether the symbol index exists or not, or is enabled or not, because Sublime had to open this file and syntax highlight it in order to provide us this preview, and as a result it just automatically has the information on symbols readily available. So this will work even though I didn't have this file open, or even if the index wasn't present. Now that is what we refer to as a local symbol. It's local to any particular file. Sublime also has the idea of project symbols, which come from the symbol index. And if we were to go up to the Go-To menu, we can see here this Go-To symbol in project, which on Windows is Control-Shift-R. And of course, that will be a different key binding if you're on Mac OS. And when you're in doubt, you can always use the menu to see exactly what key is bound to any command. Sublime will always show you the correct key, even if you change it in your default user bindings. Now, I'm going to choose that, and we get here a list of all of the global symbols across this whole project. And I could type log here like this, and it takes me to the same place, even though I didn't know what file it was actually in. So that is a very handy thing when you know the name of the thing that you want to get to, but you don't know where it's actually stored. This is one way to do something like that. Now, for this next one, we're going to open the core, the default plugin for this. This is the top level plugin in the package. We can see down here at the bottom of the file, there's this function called plugin loaded calling core.loaded. Now, what if we wanted to actually know whereabouts that was located so we could see what it's doing? Well, if you're me, you know that it's in the core file at a symbol named loaded. And if you weren't familiar with the code, one thing you could do to do something like that is use that global symbol list to find it, as we just saw. And you could also use find in files to scan through all of the files in the project as well. But because we have the symbol index, if I bring my mouse in and hover it over loaded, we get this pop-up that tells us that this is actually defined in this exact file, core.py, in the source directory at line 41. So I could use the Goto Anything panel to jump there. I could also click that with my mouse, and it has jumped me directly to that location here in this file. And the converse of that is also true. If I was working on this file and modifying the loaded function, and I wanted to know what is impacted by the modification I'm changing here, I might want to know all the places where this is referenced so I can look and see if what I'm doing is going to break them. I can hover my mouse over this, and again, I get that same hover menu there. Now it's telling me the reference. Where is this referenced? Only in one place, in override audit.py line 31, and I can click and it jumps me back here. Now this will work whether the file is open or not, either one of those files. In the first case, it opened to the core.py file for us. In the second case, it just jumped to the appropriate file. Now, this particular functionality is controlled by a setting called Show Definitions, and it defaults to being turned on. You can turn that setting off if you don't want the hover functionality of this. But this same functionality is also available from the keyboard as well. If we went up to the Goto Anything menu, there's this item here, Goto Definition and Goto Reference, which are F12 and Shift F12 here on Windows. And of course, other platforms or your default bindings may have changed this. So come to this menu to see what it is for you. So we can use F12 to go to the definition of something and Shift F12 to go to the reference. So if the cursor was in the loaded function here, I could push F12 and it jumps me directly to loaded. And if I was in loaded and I wanted to know what's referring to this, I could push Shift F12 and the same thing would work that way as well via key bindings. Now, it is possible for a symbol to have a large number of references. For example, here on the log function, if I hover the mouse, there are a lot of references here. And of course, by using the mouse, I could narrow in on any one of those and click. But what will happen if I use the key binding to do it? Well, in that case, I get a panel popping up that's showing me all of the places, and I can hover the mouse over them and have it jump to that location. And as is normally the case, I could push escape to close the panel to jump back to where I started, or if I was actually interested in one of these particular ones, say this one, I could hit enter and the cursor will jump there. Now here in our preview here, I have my screen size set down quite small to make it more visible in these videos, but there would of course be more room for you to see around the panel if you were actually doing this live. As we covered in the video on the file catalog, there are global preferences that control the catalog in general, and then we can use project folder specific settings to refine it on a folder by folder basis. The same thing is also true of the index. So we're going to look at the default preferences for Sublime, which you would get to by using preferences settings from the menu. Here I'm going to use view package file to open the default pref set. Just because that's going to give us more room here in the window. But this is the file that would be open on the left if you choose the preferences settings menu option or command palette entry. And if we jump down to line 460 or so, we can see up here, starting on line 452, there are the global folder exclude patterns, file exclude patterns, and binary file patterns. And as a quick refresher, Sublime is automatically going to want to include all files and folders from any folder you add, but it will exclude the folders from folder exclude patterns. It will exclude files that match file exclude patterns, and binary file patterns will appear in the sidebar, but they won't be offered for navigation via Goto Anything. Those are the global settings there, and then you can refine these on a folder by folder basis if you're using projects to tune those exact projects to exactly what you need. For that reason, the settings that you put here are the things that should be the things that you definitely always want to be excluded no matter what sort of project you're working on. And the defaults for these are pretty sensible. Down below this, we can see here on line 460 is the index file setting that determines whether or not the indexer is even turned on, and it defaults to true. The index workers setting, as we discussed, sets how many threads are used for indexing, how many background things, and this is guessed based on the number of cores because index workers is 0. But if you have a slower computer or you're doing a lot of things, you might want to set this explicitly to, say, for example, 1. And remember, if you want to disable indexing, you have to set index files to false. Setting index workers to 0 is setting it to a default value. Now, what we have here also is index exclude patterns, which is setting exactly what should be excluded. Now, as we can see up here, the document history for index files says the file indexing parses all files in the sidebar and builds an index of their symbols, which is required for Goto definition to work. Now, that means that the indexer is always going to index everything that appears in the sidebar by default. So the settings for the file catalog are at play. But from within that set of files, we have controls here. Now, the default index exclude pattern says that don't index a log file. Log files are probably fairly large and you probably don't want to navigate inside of it. So that is the default. Anything that we want to apply globally should go in our user version of the preferences, and the index exclude patterns is the same as the pattern for the file catalog above. If you want to augment that list, you should copy it to your settings and edit it there. Don't just add a new setting with your own file types unless you want the defaults to be indexed, because that might not do exactly what you want. But on a project-specific basis, you can modify these. Now, in order to do that, we're going to use, because I have this sample simple C program open here, edit project from the menu here to open the Sublime project file because it's currently hidden from the sidebar in this particular file. And we can see that that is because the one folder that is open here has the simple vm.sublime project in its list of file exclude patterns, and also the compiled binary in this particular case. And we also have folder exclude patterns in here. So if we wanted to tweak the indexer for this particular project, we could do it by modifying the Sublime project file. And again, you wouldn't do that by adding it to the settings object, which in this project is on lines 19 and 20 there, because these settings should go in the actual folder where they're going to apply. So as a demonstration of this, if I was to use the project symbols list, we get a list of items here, and I could choose, for example, main. here. And that's going to show us the main symbol. And because this is a C program, it's going to show me the entry point for a program. Now, there's actually 3 of these in this particular project. These 2 are stubs for projects that might be generated from this, but this is the actual one here, so I can choose that. So that's an example of there being multiple copies of the same symbol, and I have easily navigated to this in a C file. Similarly, if I did that same item again, if I checked for this is check template. When I choose this, I'm ending up here in this shell script file. This is actually a bash shell script because I work on this project primarily on Linux. So this shows that the symbol index really does index all of the files in your project and not just certain ones. Now, what we're going to do here now is modify the settings here in this folder. And we could say, for example, index exclude patterns like this. And now this is going to tell Sublime for this particular folder, what files don't we want to be indexed? And I could say, for example, star.c in here to say we don't want the symbol, the C files to be indexed. And now the indexer has, run. If I was to use the project symbol list again, when I type main, I can see this one because this is a C++ file and not a C file, but the C file version and the main entry point to this project are now gone from the symbol list. That file still exists, of course. This list just isn't finding it. And we could also do that in the other direction as well. Remember, along with the exclude patterns, there's also an include patterns as well. So we could say index include patterns. Now, remember, this works the same as the items for the file catalog. By default, Sublime is going to use everything but the things you exclude. When you use the index include patterns or file include patterns or folder include patterns, you're telling it for those specific things, the default is absolutely nothing except for what you add here. So if I was to say index this, we're telling it I don't care what you think about what you should be including in the index, only include C files. And I will save that and the indexer will run. And now when I jump to here, I can type main. And there's the C version of that and that version there. So that's working. We haven't told it to index C++ files, so the one we just saw a second ago is no longer in this list. But this one is here. We could get back to this one now. And if we were to use the template item, well, there isn't one in here anymore because we haven't told it to index the bash files, so they don't appear here in the symbol list. So using these particular settings, the index exclude patterns, usually you can dial in exactly for your particular project what shouldn't be included in the index. And again, you usually exclude something like a folder with a lot of files that you're not interested in navigating into. For example, if you're a Node.js developer, you might not be interested in navigating into any of the JavaScript files that are inside of the node modules folder, for example. You could get those excluded from the index if you wanted to. The Goto Anything panel is very handy for navigating to a file or a point within a file, but it kind of presumes that you know what file that you want to be editing in the first place. And as we've seen in the video here, being able to navigate to a symbol, even if you don't necessarily know where it's stored or where it's being referenced, can be an invaluable way to navigate around inside of your projects and maybe even gain a deeper understanding into how all of the different pieces are fitting together. Now, keep in mind that the examples that we saw here today were Python and C and a little bit of bash shell scripting as well. But this really is something that is completely determined by the syntax definition in use and its meta information to specify the symbol information for Sublime. So it should work with any file that has the appropriate meta information, although the detail may or may not depend on the type of language that you're using. But you definitely should give this a try. It really makes life a lot easier. Now, that's all we have for this particular video. So if you found this useful or helpful, please use the buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And remember, you can always ask any questions, comments, requests for clarification, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics down in the comment section below this video. I'll see you next week for the second video in the series on package and plugin development in Sublime Text. And until then, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.